and welcome to this latest episode of Chasing Creativity. I'm Kiran Manral, your host. Today my guest is poet, art critic, cultural theorist and independent curator and Sahitya Akademi Award for Translation, Ranjit Hoskote. Welcome to the show, Ranjit.
Thank you so much, Kiran. It's a real pleasure to be here with you.
My honor completely, Ranjit. You've been doing such stellar work and we've known each other for years, and we're not going to carbon date ourselves, of course. But tell me, Ranjit, I've always been curious. How did art happen to you? How did the world of words happen to you? What was your childhood like?
I have to say that I was, in effect, born into a world of art and music and words, because both of my parents were very committed to the idea that art is just part of normal life. Mm-hmm. So I grew up, my earliest memories actually are of listening to the music that they played. So we had, when I was growing up, this was the early 70s, we had a turntable, a garage, a kind of extinct form today. So, I remember afternoons of listening to, it could be Ali Akbar Khan Sahab and Ravi Shankar, Sarod and Sitar, or it could be Tchaikovsky, or it could be the music that my parents loved from the 50s and 60s. It could be Emilio Pericoli one day, for instance. It could be Kishore Kumar. So there was a very diverse sense of artistic expression. And that's just the music. Mm-hmm. They were also in love with the visual image. Mm-hmm. And they recited poetry. And for instance, my mother would just simply read to me from Ghalib at a point when I had zero understanding of what was being said, but I just caught the musicality and the cadence of it. And my father would read to me from, his taste was far more orthodox and classical, sort of romantic, Coleridge, Blake, Wordsworth.
So Kublai Khan with his
very much. In Xanadu did Kublai Khan, stately pleasure dome, decree.
All that happened when you were too young to understand what state of mind he was in when he wrote it.
Absolutely. But enough to understand that this is somehow a thing that gives you goosebumps and that opens up doors for you that are visionary, hallucinatory. I guess it also helped that although I was born in Bombay, my parents moved to Goa when I was 1.
Okay.
So I grew up in the lap of nature. Mm-hmm. And also in a very Indo-Iberian culture, because the Portuguese had just been gone about 10 years.
Okay.
So there was a multiplicity of languages. Portuguese was still being spoken. There was Konkani. There was Marathi, Hindustani, because part of my family speaks an old-style Hindustani. There was English. So I also grew up among languages, constantly translating even before I knew what translation meant.
Okay. So words were always a multiplicity of words and multiplicity of languages were part of your childhood. How did art come about? Music, yes. Words, yes. But do you have a childhood memory of some artwork that you came across and struck you and you said, wow, this is something that really, really interests me and now I need to find out more?
Actually, my parents thought that I would be a visual artist.
Really?
I was thought to be rather good at it at school. And it was the usual round of the art competitions and so on. And I really did love the visual image, and my parents encouraged that. And of course, there were books at home where my first acquaintance with the art of the world came through reproductions. So years and years later, when I first went, for instance, to the National Gallery in London, it was like coming home because I knew all those works from childhood.
Oh, lovely.
So that was very strong, except that it was partly the way in which art got routinized at school, which turned me off it. But I think there was also a natural move towards the word for me. But this was my entry point into the world of the visual image. So I went from making visual art, making drawings and paintings, to responding to them and then bearing witness to them, writing about them.
How lovely. But I'm very curious about the routinization of art that you speak of in school and how it put you off. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
I don't want to be harsh on my teachers because there were some wonderful teachers that we had. But as you moved on towards 10th grade, and I took art as an optional subject.
Okay.
It then fell into a set of rules.
Mm-hmm.
There were genres that you had to work your way through, which is great for training. But there was also this system of art competitions. And there I think you're at the mercy of somebody's idea of good taste or what is appropriate. And I think that kills creativity.
Shankar's art competition.
I did that too.
Won that too. Right there with you, rainy day.
Yeah. But I think it's when people start telling you that this may be excessive and you need to fit into the boxes available. I think for all creative endeavors, I mean, we're talking here about chasing creativity.
Yes.
I think it's this early setting in of regulations that would kill creativity.
So that's such a pity, actually, because we have so much talent that we don't know could go on to be what brilliance, and that could get stifled because of exactly what you say. You moved from perhaps not wanting to follow a career in the visual art to writing about it, to exploring it with your words. And was there a perceptible, I mean, did you at any point decide that this is how I want to be, or was there another life path that you sort of charted for yourself and fell into this perchance?
I had actually wanted to do architecture. And in this country, you need to do 2 years of science to get into architecture because it's still very much in the paradigm of civil engineering. So I did science against the advice of my parents. Like, unlike most parents who seem to, in my generation and yours, they probably would have insisted on science. But my parents thought I should have gone to art school.
Okay.
So instead of that, I did 2 rather brutal years of science in which I had not a great degree of competence and didn't do well enough to get into architecture.
Oh, Lord. Okay.
But I then took a gap here and traveled and viewed exhibitions and had a great experience of seeing Charles Correa's amazing exhibition, Vistara. It was a survey of Indian architecture through his very particular lens. And that transformed my life. So I didn't know it then, but it set in place my curatorial career, which would then develop much, much later. But just the idea of how an exhibition can transform your consciousness, how it can open the doors of perception, all that came to me in that year. That was 1986.
86.
Yeah. And then I figured that what I could do instead is to do what I was also very interested in, which is the social sciences. So then I went back to my dear old college and did politics, economics, and sociology. And then began to write on art while I was at college.
You were already writing on art while you were at college. Because I know you from the time when you were at the Times of India and writing on art. Between the time you were in college to Times of India, how did you hone the reviewing skills? Was it just going to a lot of exhibitions? If anyone is interested in art and actually is looking at, getting into the reviewing space, how do they go about it?
Okay, first things first, I don't think there's a reviewing space anymore.
There isn't, right? No, you're right. So you're very right.
True. But the other thing is that there was no between college and the Times of India. I was in my second year BA when I became the art critic to the Times of India.
Oh, wonderful. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine. It seems highly eccentric in retrospect. But it was really quite amazing because I wrote a piece on Vivan Sundaram's exhibition, Long Night, which was just across college. I went to Elphinstone and the Jahangir Art Gallery was right across. So part of this socialization into art also had to do with the fact that my parents had always taken me to the art galleries on weekends or several times a month. Then when I went to college, I essentially spent a lot of my time in what would later be the Arts Quarter. So Shanta Gokhale, who had just been appointed arts editor of the Times, I gave the piece to her. And she published it, to my surprise. And then to my even greater surprise, she asked if I'd be interested in staying on and writing on art for her new arts pages.
Oh, wonderful.
So that's how it began.
Those were lovely times when we had arts pages and books pages. Ranjit, tell me, why do human beings need art and literature?
Honestly, I think it's because if we didn't have art and literature and cultural expression, we would all simply be reduced to malfunctioning machines. I think it's crucial that we have these invitations to larger dimensions of ourselves or things we're in danger of losing because our routines commandeer our time and attention. And also, I think in each case, art or the arts tell us about who we could be.
Mm-hmm.
They're about the future. They're about potential. They're about giving yourself agency to change your consciousness, to change the world. I think too often we think that the arts are an escape from reality, but I think that actually they're a way of bringing us back to an enhanced sense of reality.
You speak about it being a window to the future, but it also perhaps is a window to the past. And do you sense that art sort of offers you a glimpse into what has been and, as you said, what might be?
The past never really goes away. I mean, you're a writer yourself, so you know this when you write, that you're working from references and resonances and impulses that come to you from what's gone before. But that energy is carrying itself forward. So I think when we work in the arts, we are constantly in the position of being catalysts in this relay.
Mm-hmm.
We are carrying things from the past into the future. We're also sometimes crafting entirely new forms. Now, for the last 2 months, I've been having a series of conversations, both private and public, with Andrea Anastasio, who's a wonderful Italian artist and designer. And Andrea always says, I don't create new things. I rediscover things from the past.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, it helps us to think about how the past could be a reservoir of forms. Mm-hmm. Some of them are redemptive. Others might be sinister.
Okay.
It's a question of how we keep going back to the constituents that make us who we are.
Okay.
And take that forward, whether it's in painting or installation, theater, music, cinema, poetry, the novel.
That's very interesting. How does it take us closer to who we are? And that's a huge question I think all of us keep asking ourselves. You've curated so many exhibitions, Ranjit, over the past so many years. As a curator, is there something about the job of curating that the layperson doesn't understand that you wish they would understand? It just seems, from the outside that you bring together a bunch of whatever and put it all together. But that's not it, right?
No, it's not. Because the exhibition is a life form. And if you're a responsive and responsible curator, you're attentive to this.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a question of just bringing together a bunch of objects and putting them up in a reasonably tasteful way. It's really about bearing witness to the practices of the artists you're inviting, or to the interrelationships among the works if it's a group exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
What I would like from viewers is something that we could call the beholder's share.
Okay.
Because too often, viewers or readers also, they look at what you offer and they say, right, so what are we getting out of this?
Mm-hmm.
To which sometimes the answer might be, you're part of this too. Whether it's a novel or a painting or an exhibition, it's not complete without what readers and viewers bring to it.
So it's not purely transactional, it is interactive. And that is something that the viewer needs to understand and to experience it completely in its entirety. Ranjit, when you put together an exhibition, and very often they're very different. Sometimes it's a single artist. Sometimes it's a curated something along a theme that you've done, or different forms of art, different artists coming together. Is there something specific that you feel ties it all together, that you are looking for, some kind of element that you want to unite everything?
That's actually 5 questions. So let's try and unpack them, or at least I'll try and address some of these crucial questions you asked. For one, and this again is something I would like viewers to get a sense of, is that there is a whole typology of exhibitions. There could be a survey or a monographic show devoted to a movement or a period or a single artist. There could be a retrospective, looking back across the artist's work, or what some of us call an introspective, the kind of exhibition that's immersive and just puts you into a mood of reflection on a practice or a period. Then there are group shows. Then there are other kinds of, there might be a pop-up exhibition that responds in the moment to some urgency. So what ties it all together for me is, for one, a play of what I think of as surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, something that is predictable in the best sense.
So these are two this is a paradox, a surprise.
It's an interplay for me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And I like that. I think it's also true of music, for instance. Music for me is a huge metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
It's an experience and a metaphor for me. I like the way in which, for instance, there's a promise of steadiness and predictability, which can suddenly be broken by a syncopation or a variation or something in music. So to me, that's always been an interesting way of making exhibitions. But also, for me, when I think back about all the exhibitions I've done, the one that was probably the most important to me was called The Sacred Everyday.
Okay.
It was in two venues in Goa, the Adil Shah Palace, the old Secretariat, and the Convent of Santa Monica in Old Goa, which is a space that's between the sacred and the worldly. And to me, this was a transhistorical exhibition. The oldest objects in it came from the 6th century. They were tantric devis.
Mm-hmm.
And the most recent had been literally commissioned for the show. And between that was a huge spread of forms through which the human imagination tried to cope with what is divine, what is beyond it. So this, to me, is what makes an exhibition worth doing. The stretch, the athletic nature of the imagination, the openness to what is beyond you.
And when you mention this exhibition, I'm also thinking that the location and the setting also plays a very important role. So the very location of these exhibitions, when you're talking about Adil Shah's palace and the Convent of Santa Monica, that also lends its own infusion into the...
Very much, because the exhibition, both parts of the exhibition, I mean, it responded to the site and the histories of the site.
Absolutely.
So that was very crucial. So at Santa Monica, for instance, we had, among the objects displayed was an amazing series of paintings by Manish Soni,
Mm-hmm.
who paints in the Rajasthani miniature style, but he was painting the life of Jesus.
Ah.
So it was also, it was a way of experimenting in a generative way with an audience.
Mm-hmm.
So the question there was, how would an audience that is used to a certain representation of biblical narratives come in and see Jesus, the apostles, crossing the Sea of Galilee, the Last Supper, all of this in Mughal or Rajput or Safavid or Dakhani style?
That's very, very interesting indeed. How did the audience respond?
Amazingly. I mean, they were really, at first, some of them were struck by the unfamiliarity of the representation,
Mm-hmm.
but they all were carried along. And the museum was very hospitable to this experiment.
Oh, wonderful. It sounds wonderful. It sounds absolutely fabulous. Ranjit, you're a writer too. You write poetry, you write works of art, write about art, sorry. What is your process like when you're writing poetry? Do you have a process at all?
I wish I could say I get up every morning at 6 a.m.
No, you'd be lying and we know it.
Absolutely, I do nothing of the kind. But what I do is to preserve over years and years notebooks in which I put down images or fragments or things I've overheard or misheard. To me, something you mishear in overhearing a conversation can spark off, a stray phrase, and then it sits with you for years and then,
Mm-hmm.
Commands your attention at some point. Or things I've begun to work on. So my process is mining these notebooks of fragments and notations.
After they've simmered in your subconscious for long enough.
That's right.
So there's no routine and nothing like Stephen King tells us, you have to sit at the desk every day and the muse will come. That doesn't happen.
You have to sit at the desk
every day.
If not wait for the muse, at least try and, propitiate the muse.
Mm.
So, but it also depends on the book. For instance, some years ago, I was working on a book that eventually became Jonah Whale.
Jonah Whale.
So that also came out of a very strong convergence of my research interests
Mm-hmm.
and my poetry. So I was looking there very strongly at the histories of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So it began, for instance, with thinking about what the atlas would look like if instead of having a landmass or continent-based focus, we flipped that around and looked at the globe as basically water.
As the oceans.
So what are the histories of the oceans? How did people come together? How did new languages get created?
Mm-hmm.
So that for me became very fertile. because it also allowed me to open up to other parts of my consciousness. So, for instance, many songs in the Gangetic area, which we now know as, the Bandish lines of Thumris, which just become empty artifacts in one sense, or a scaffolding for a raga. But they have political content. They often have to do with people who were taken away as indentured labor to Fiji or to Mauritius or to Trinidad. It has to do with juridical violence. For instance, when you say "Saiyan ko le gaye thanedar," it sounds like some kind of romantic song, but you think about the violence of what is going on there. So those bandishes actually encode a lot of this history, which links landmass to ocean. And so there, for instance, there was a fair amount of research that went into the poetry as well. So that's one aspect of my poetry. I remember I'm babbling, right?
No, you're being very, very interesting because, Jonah Whale, I very honestly thought about it with a biblical reference.
Which was very, very strong for me also.
It was, so would you like to tell us more about that? And how did it happen with this exhibition that you said, research, the one at Goa? Was this also part of something that led up to Jonah Whale?
I'll tell you, like I said, I spent my formative years of childhood in Goa, but also in Margao, which is the heartland of Catholic South Goa. So it was real to me. Altars, icons, liturgy, biblical narratives, these were all extremely real to me. And my parents encouraged me from very early on to have a very diverse religious experience. So the scriptures and books, even if it was in the form of children's books, I had a pictorial Bible as a kid. So there was never a sense that one had to choose one religion over another. In fact, my parents were pluralists, and that's what I inherit.
I love that because my parents were the same, but the result is I don't follow any religion today.
That's a choice. But I think the important thing about being brought up that way is that it immunizes you against bigotry. And I think that was, for me, a very important experience of childhood. And when I think back on that, it allowed me, for instance, to form a very close psychological affinity with Jonah, who was a very unlikely, as you know, a very unlikely prophet. He just simply doesn't, whatever the Lord tells him to do, he does the opposite. Gets into trouble, gets other people into trouble. And
gets swallowed by a whale.
Absolutely. And somehow or the other manages to, by detours and indirections, comes back to doing whatever he has to do. So I find Jonah a very compelling and very contemporary figure. So, a prophet who has flaws, who has doubt, who isn't just sounding, absolutely full of certitude. So someone like who we might be, navigating a difficult and turbulent time.
Lovely. We'll just take a short break and we'll be right back in some time. Please stay with us. We're chatting with Ranjit Hoskote. Ranjit, you're writing poetry in an era where everyone is writing non-fiction. Is that an act of bravery, an act of rebellion? What do you call it?
It's probably an act of foolhardiness. But I have nothing against non-fiction, but I do feel that poetry also has a claim to the public sphere, which is what this book of mine called Hunch Prose came out of. So I was looking at poetry as the ill-favored cousin of prose in a way. So Hunch Prose, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. So for me, that was a very powerful image, that this completely malformed figure still makes this incredible music of the carillons that, resounds across Paris. So for me, that was a way of thinking about poetry, how however much it may be pushed into a corner, it still has power to make, yes, exactly, that's relevant. So that was my claim. But I also, as a writer, am very happy to be around at a time when all genres are flourishing. Non-fiction, biography, fiction in multiple languages, poetry, also at various scales, from something you could literally read on the screen in 2 minutes to large epic projects that, are best read on paper, in print.
What made you take up Lal Did? She was a figure who was almost forgotten. And you came out with this wonderful book on her. And I still remember your book. I read it a while ago. It was lovely, and it led me to research up about her. So what made you look back to her and, bring her out of hibernation, so to speak?
The beginning for me was really just very deeply personal and autobiographical. I belong to a diasporic Kashmiri community. So the background is Kashmiri, but we left Kashmir centuries ago. So as happens in all diasporas, you lose language very quickly because it's no longer relevant where you are. So for me, it was a way of reconnecting with an ancestral past and to reconnect with the language I might have spoken if I'd never left, or if we'd never left. But very quickly, it also developed into just a love for the poet herself. It developed because it took about 20 years to do it, which also meant learning the language and immersing myself in the contexts and recognizing that it actually was a living tradition that anonymous people had contributed to the corpus of the saint poet over hundreds of years. So the signature belongs to Lal Did or Laleshwari or Lala Rifa, but people have brought their life experiences to it and guided by the poet's temperament and the form, which is the vak, the 4-line verse. So these people could have been men or women, pandits or Muslims, learned scribes or peasants or shepherds. To me, the work of Lala became an expanded group portrait of Kashmir. And these were also the years in which Kashmir was going through its worst crisis, and it's still in a critical state. So it was also for me a political commitment to stand with and help give voice to people and a place that was under such intense oppression from all sides.
And there is also this, I don't know if I could call it a pressure or an obligation. I can't get the right word for it right now, but to be faithful to the time of the poet and to the milieu in which she has written her work. And you say you were working on this for 20 years. So were there lots of visits to Kashmir to actually locate where and how she has put those words down?
There were a number of visits to Kashmir that I made in that period, but those were transformative in multiple ways, both in terms of meeting people, visiting shrines and other places. But in terms of figuring out how the vaks had taken shape, that work almost always got done in the library or in archives, or just for once sitting quietly at my desk and comparing different versions, for instance, or reading various commentaries. So there was a scholarly aspect to this because I also put together a concordance of the different available editions and I annotated the verses. So if you read the book, you could read the translation, you could read the annotations if you like. There was also an introduction that provides the multiple contexts of Lala's poetry, how it marks a confluence between an earlier Shaiva and a later Sufi tradition, for instance. And for me, this informs everything I do, this idea that we are pluralist, and that's the only way to look at culture, to look at the confluences that shape us. That, it's, to me, from childhood onwards, that's been a commitment, whether it was articulated or not. Increasingly, it's very strongly articulated.
And today's day and times, that's a very bold political statement to be making as well, Ranjit.
Such is life. You have to be true to what you believe in.
Absolutely. And may we all remember that we are pluralists as a nation. We are a syncretic nation. And I will not go further into that right here. But in an age where the creative space is constantly intruded upon by demands of time, work pressure, Netflix, social media, how does a creative person safeguard their space?
I wish again I could say that, I switch everything off and focus, but I don't. I watch The Blacklist. I eagerly wait for new episodes. And I think you have to be aware that your attention is fairly scarce and you need to focus on what you're working on, cut away distractions. These are all noble thoughts. The fact is that you simply have to navigate your way through this chaos in whatever way seems best. What works well for me is, I think, embracing new challenges that arise in any of the fields that I work in, and then working towards these outcomes in relatively sharp, short bursts.
Okay.
But having said that, there are long-term projects that take forever and ever and ever. And there's a consolation in coming back to them. And I hope my editors and publishers aren't listening to this, because they're saying, consolation, you're crazy. We've been waiting for this book for 10 years.
You're going to reach home after this podcast is out to a barrage of emails demanding, where is the book?
Exactly.
I'm going to quote something from Hunch Prose. You've quoted Clarice Lispector. So hear me with your whole body. And that's such a wonderful evocative line. Do you think the act of reading or the act of watching is something that needs all the senses to be involved? How would you elaborate on this?
What may have happened in our turn towards modernity is that we've narrowed our sensory spectrum. And there's a great deal of research done on this, and I'm just summarizing in the wake of that research. But for instance, in the visual arts, I think from the Renaissance onwards, there's been a privileging of sight, of vision, as the only sense through which one can appreciate art. Or in writing, now there's the sense that it's the word, it's rationality. But I think if you look at forms of art before this, or if you look at other forms of art, there is a mandate that you need to respond with the totality of your senses. If you think about opera, for instance, or you think about the jatra, or think about any of our prior dance or theater forms, the expectation is that you have a 360-degree awareness. You're listening, you're seeing, you're smelling, you're alive to whatever's going on. It might be a dance, might be a theater performance. And to me, this is crucial. But in my particular case, I think the 20 years I spent translating and working on Lal Ded, for instance, that was a very, very strong apprenticeship to a woman who had exemplary courage and fortitude and the ability to to lead an experimental life. But also Clarice Lispector's writing, for instance, or Adrian Rich, Jory Graham, Sharon Olds, Louise Gluck. I mean, it seems very, very strange, but it was a series of, I don't know why it sounds strange, possibly because I'm a man, but when I think back, it was very often women writers whose work I responded to, in the way in which they opened up new ways of thinking, feeling, subject matter, new horizons.
It's very, very interesting indeed. And you must be one of the rare men who defy that research statistic that says that men only read male writers and women read both genders. Yes, there's research that says that.
Oh my goodness.
So I'm so glad that we have somebody who reads us. What is the most challenging part of curating for you?
Finding the ladder. No. People who have gone through the excruciating but exhilarating experience of working on a biennial will always tell you that a biennial is a place where they bring together 55 artists and have just one ladder. So that's where this comes from. But no, to be serious, to not be facetious, the most challenging part of the exhibition is when it opens. And you're having spent a lot of time thinking about the works, the practices, the mise en scène, how you bring it together. Then you're finally thinking, how are viewers going to respond to this? And then you have to live with the fact that however you've created the exhibition narrative, people are likely to approach it in any way that they want. And then it's up to you as the curator to mediate that ground between what you had in mind and how viewers experience the show, which then opens up everything else, the walkthroughs, the discussions, the associated events. So I think for me, that's when the exhibition really comes to life.
How wonderful. We are being asked to see ourselves as heirs to a single past and to work towards a single future. The country has had plural past and it should have a plural future, and we have to take a stand for this. We just spoke about this, but I'd love you to elaborate on this in terms of the creative space. What does this mean for artists and creators and for people in this space of making statements without making statements or making statements?
Years ago, I thought to myself, whenever you have a political situation where you're told that there's only one way of thinking about the history of a society, it's like saying you can have only one color of the spectrum. So that leads to color blindness. And to me, that's really a tragedy, because if you insist that there's just this one narrative to your history and that everything else is alien or foreign or a contamination or a danger, you're actually committing cultural suicide. I'll offer you an example. For instance, Mughal architecture. We have had a number of extremely ill-informed and ignorant people who say that, this is some foreign import that we should get rid of, or an imposition. If you look at any element in Mughal architecture, you'll see how it's a celebration of synthesis. You can have a hammam from Khorasan, which forms a synthesis with elements from Jain and Hindu temples, Vaishnav temples from Gujarat. There are immediate responses to landscape. There's the use of chhajjas and jalis. It's an extraordinary coming together of elements that had never come together before and had not come together anywhere else. And which also includes, if you will, Hindu temples. People don't realize this, that there are temples from the Mughal period that could not have been built before because they're working with plans and layouts that come from Iran, for instance. Or there's a great coming together of cosmic and archetypal ideas. The idea of the 7 paradises, which comes from Iran, it links to the Navagraha idea here. So you're looking constantly at a meeting and a convergence of dissimilar energies and something that is beautiful that's produced out of that. So it's a complete waste of psychic energy to want to forget that. I mean, you're just committing yourself to amnesia if you do this. And that's just one example.
And what do creative people do in a situation like this, in a space like this, in a social cultural situation like this?
They need to bear witness to what is truly important, which is diversity, which is the plural, which is the unexpected. And that's why I say, we deserve plural futures. We can't be held to ransom by people who will tell us what is to be done and how it's to be done.
Wonderful words there, Ranjit. We need to have plural futures and not be held to ransom. Final question, Ranjit. What do we see from you next? What are you writing? What are you working on in curation? I know there's a long list of things, but please do tell us all.
Literally the next project is my translation of Mir Taqi Mir, who lived at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's an amazing transitional and threshold figure in Urdu poetry. And this began as a Twitter project.
Really?
Yeah.
Tell us all.
I used to put out, in Roman transliteration, one of the couplets from Mir, from his Divan, my translation, and then there was always an image, which was either drawn from Mughal painting or Rajput or Safavid or Dakhani painting. So this was, it was an invitation to people to see how this voice is not to be shut in some archive. It's a living voice, because it was a living voice in its time. And too many of us think that, this is some kind of ornate, ornamental poetry that can't speak to us. But it does speak to us. It's resonant. It's very powerful. So
that's coming up next.
That's coming up next, with some luck by the end of the year.
Lovely. And what about exhibitions that you're curating?
There are various plans, but they're yet taking shape.
All the very best for them. Thank you so much for taking time out for this, Ranjit. This was a lovely discussion.
Kiran, thank you so much. This was really marvelous. I'm glad we reconnected properly after a long, long while. And thank you very much indeed.
All the very best for all your projects, Ranjit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And with that, this is a wrap on this episode of Chasing Creativity. We were chatting with the very erudite Ranjit Hoskote. This is Kiran Manral signing out. Follow me on my social media at Kiran Manral everywhere. And do subscribe to this show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Bingepods, or wherever you get your dose of audio content. See you next week.